He was just doing a routine dive and wasn't expecting anything unusual. But on the seabed, he spotted a car that didn't look like wreckage. When it was brought to the surface and opened, it became clear that something was hidden inside that should not have survived for decades. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The morning began without any sense of importance, the kind of day that carried no weight in advance and asked for nothing except to be lived through and forgotten. The sea lay calm beneath a pale sky, its surface broken only by a low, steady ripple that suggested movement without urgency. For him, this was comfort, predictability. The water was doing what it always did, and that was enough. He'd learned long ago not to romanticize the ocean. It was not a companion, not a mystery waiting to be solved, and certainly not a stage for heroics. It was a system, immense and indifferent, governed by rules that did not bend for curiosity or bravado. That respect had kept him alive through years of diving that were never meant to impress anyone. He was not a professional. He was not chasing records or rare footage. He was simply a man who had found, beneath the surface, a place where the noise of the world loosened its grip. His life above water was orderly, even restrained. Work followed routine. Responsibilities stacked neatly, one on top of another. He carried them well, but they pressed on him all the same. Diving was where that pressure thinned out. Down there, everything reduced itself to breath, movement, awareness. No expectations, no explanations. Just the quiet discipline of staying alive in a place that would never adjust to him. He checked his equipment with the same care he always did, not because he feared failure in the abstract, but because repetition built trust. The tank valve turned smoothly. The regulator breathed cleanly. The gauge needle rested exactly where it should. Every strap lay flat. Every buckle sat where his hands expected to find it without looking. He wore no unnecessary gear, nothing experimental, nothing that belonged to someone chasing novelty. A reliable light, a cutting tool he hoped never to use, a spool tucked away in case orientation became uncertain. Practical choices made by someone who had learned, over time, that the ocean punished assumptions far more harshly than mistakes. The sight itself was familiar. Too familiar, some would say. A stretch of seabed that divers often passed over in search of something more interesting. No wrecks marked on charts. No reefs worth photographing. No dramatic drop-offs or underwater formations. Just sand, low vegetation, scattered stone, and the subtle traces of currents that shifted the landscape in slow, patient ways. He liked that. Familiar ground did not distract him. It allowed his attention to settle inward. The entry into the water was unremarkable. The temperature met him gently, neither shocking nor comforting, simply present. The surface noise fell away as his head submerged, replaced by the muted hush that always followed. With each breath, the world narrowed to rhythm and pressure. The descent was controlled, unhurried, his body adjusting as it had countless times before. Light filtered down in soft gradients, losing warmth as depth increased, until the colors around him flattened into blues and grays. At the bottom, the seabed unfolded exactly as expected. Fine sand stretched outward, interrupted here and there by darker patches where vegetation clung stubbornly to the ground. Small fish moved in cautious arcs, keeping their distance, uninterested in him beyond the immediate calculation of risk. The water was clear enough to see far ahead, but not so clear that everything revealed itself at once. He liked that, too. Visibility that demanded patience. He followed his planned route without deviation, compass checks confirming what his instincts already knew. The current was light, almost lazy, drifting just enough to remind him it existed. His movements were economical, designed to disturb as little as possible. He had no intention of stirring up clouds of silt that would blind him to the very environment he came to observe. Time passed in the way it always did underwater, stretching and compressing in ways that felt intuitive only while submerged. He did not count minutes. He counted breaths, distance, awareness. Everything about the dive reinforced its ordinariness. Nothing pulled at his attention. Nothing demanded reevaluation. That was why the first sign of change did not register immediately. It was not a shape at first, not something his mind could name, just a line where there should not have been one, a suggestion of geometry that did not belong to sand or stone. He noticed it without stopping, the way one notices a flicker in peripheral vision and dismisses it as nothing. The ocean was full of illusions, shadows bending and stretching under shifting light. But the line persisted. He slowed, not out of alarm, but habit. Anything that resisted a quick categorization deserved a second look. He adjusted his position slightly, angling his body to bring the anomaly into clearer view without kicking up sediment. As he drew closer, the line became an edge. Not eroded. Not broken. Clean. Symmetry announced itself next, and with it a subtle tightening in his chest. Nature produced balance, but rarely precision, rarely repetition that mirrored itself so clearly. The longer he looked, the more certain he became that what he was seeing had been shaped by intention. He stopped completely, hovering just above the seabed, letting the water carry him in slow, controlled drift. His light came on, not because the environment demanded it, but because clarity did. The beam cut through the water, revealing more than his eyes alone had offered. The edge connected to another, then another. Angles emerged, curves followed. The outline resolved itself with a quiet inevitability. A car. The recognition brought no rush of excitement, no instinctive thrill. Instead, a cold, measured disbelief settled in. Cars did not belong here. Not like this. Wrecks were chaotic things, twisted and collapsed by impact and time. They bore the violence of their arrival. This object did not. He circled slowly, careful to keep distance. The vehicle rested upright, its orientation aligned with the seabed as if placed there deliberately. The roof was intact. The sides showed no signs of crushing. Barnacles and marine growth clung to the surface, but they did not obscure the form. They decorated it, tracing its lines rather than consuming them. There were no debris fields, no scattered parts, no indications of a crash site or dumping ground. The sand around it looked different, subtly disturbed in a way that suggested past movement, not ongoing decay, as if the seabed itself had once been rearranged and then left alone to settle. His breathing grew slower, not faster. This was not panic. This was focus. He approached closer, shining his light along the body. The doors were shut. The seams between panels were visible, sharply defined, far cleaner than he would have expected from an object that should have been surrendering itself to corrosion. He found himself studying the details the way one studies handwriting, looking for inconsistencies, for signs of age or neglect. The wheels were present, but something about them felt wrong. Not damaged, simply inactive, as if they had never been meant to turn. He resisted the urge to touch it. That restraint came from experience. Touching changed things. Touching turned observation into interference. He reminded himself that this was still a dive, not an investigation. Then he saw the line. At first, it blended into the background. thin and dark, traced over with growth that mimicked the surrounding vegetation. But once seen, it could not be unseen. It ran from beneath the vehicle, disappearing into the sand at a shallow angle, taut and purposeful. A tether. His stomach tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. Objects that were tethered had been secured. Secured things were meant to stay where they were. He hovered there, suspended between curiosity and caution, the silence of the water pressing in around him. The ocean did not care what he thought. It would not warn him. It would not stop him. He marked the position carefully. Depth, bearing, distance from known landmarks. His mind shifted into documentation mode, the way it always did when something mattered. He knew, even then, that whatever this was, it did not belong to him alone. It deserved more eyes, more preparation, more respect than a spontaneous decision could offer. As he began his ascent, leaving the car exactly as he had found it, a strange awareness followed him upward, the sense that he had crossed an invisible boundary, that the dive he had planned was over, replaced by something else entirely. Above him, the surface shimmered, unchanged and unaware. The sea gave no sign that it had revealed anything at all. The surface welcomed him back without ceremony. Light, wind, the low slap of water against the hull of the boat all returned at once, abrupt and almost intrusive after the controlled quiet below. He removed his regulator and took in air that felt strangely thin compared to the dense, measured breaths he had just left behind. For a moment, he stayed still, floating, letting his heartbeat settle before pulling himself up. Nothing about the world above suggested that anything had changed. The sky looked the same as it had an hour earlier. The sea rolled on with the same patient indifference. If he had not just seen what he had seen, the dive would already be fading into memory, filed away as another routine descent in an unremarkable place. But the image would not release him. As he stripped off his gear piece by piece, his mind replayed details with increasing clarity. The clean seams, the way the car rested upright, aligned, balanced, the absence of violence, the tether disappearing into the sand like an afterthought left behind on purpose. He had seen dumped objects before, old appliances, scrap metal, even vehicles. None of them looked like that. None of them carried intention so clearly. He sat on the bench and dried his hands slowly, forcing himself to slow down his thoughts. Excitement was dangerous. It led to bad decisions, especially in environments that punished haste. Whatever lay on the seabed was not going anywhere. It had waited long enough already. He opened his logbook, not to write poetry or speculation, but facts. Coordinates, estimated depth, visibility, orientation. A sketch made with careful lines marking where the tether appeared to run. The act of recording grounded him, turned the discovery into something manageable, something that obeyed order. Only then did he allow himself to consider what it might be. Art crossed his mind first. Submerged installations were not unheard of, though usually they were publicized, mapped, discussed. They did not hide in forgotten stretches of sand with no documentation, nor were they typically anchored with such discretion. Art wanted to be seen eventually. This object seemed content to remain unnoticed. The thought of criminal activity followed, unwelcome but necessary. Smuggling, disposal, evidence meant never to resurface. Yet even that explanation felt incomplete. Criminal dumping tended to be rushed, careless. This was precise, controlled, almost respectful. By the time he finished securing his equipment, one conclusion had settled firmly in place. Whatever the car was, it had not arrived there by accident. Someone had wanted it exactly where it was. He did not return to the water that day. The urge was there, sharp and persistent, but he resisted it. Going back alone, unprepared, would serve nothing but his own curiosity. If the object posed any risk, physical or legal, discovering it without witnesses or documentation could turn a remarkable find into a personal disaster. Instead, he did what experience had taught him to do when something exceeded the boundaries of a casual dive. He reached out. The first calls were cautious. He did not describe the object with drama or certainty. He gave facts. A vehicle-shaped structure on the seabed, unusual condition, anchored, possible artificial installation. His tone was measured, professional, even though he was speaking to people who knew him well enough to hear the tension he kept carefully controlled. Responses varied. Skepticism, naturally. Curiosity. A few jokes he ignored, but the coordinates caught attention. So did the mention of the tether. Anchored objects were not jokes. By the end of the day, a plan had begun to form. They met 2 days later, early, while the water still lay calm. The group was small by design. Too many divers created confusion, stirred sediment, complicated communication. Each person brought something specific. Experience with controlled lifts. Familiarity with underwater documentation. Someone who understood rigging better than anyone else in the group. They were not thrill seekers. They were methodical people who respected boundaries. Before entering the water, they reviewed everything, the initial observations, the lack of visible damage, the tether, the unknown weight, the possibility that the object contained something hazardous or sensitive. They agreed on one principle above all others. No one would force anything. If resistance appeared, they would stop and reassess. The descent felt different this time. Anticipation replaced routine. The water seemed heavier, as if it sensed the shift in purpose. He led the way, controlling pace, checking behind him frequently to ensure the group maintained spacing. The seabed emerged gradually, familiar and yet altered by what lay hidden upon it. When the car came into view again, its presence felt more pronounced, less like an anomaly and more like a fixture. It occupied space with quiet confidence, as if it had always belonged there. They approached from multiple angles, lights illuminating different surfaces. With more eyes, more details emerged. The growth on the body was uneven, suggesting the object had remained stationary for a very long time. Barnacles clustered along edges, but avoided certain seams entirely, as if repelled by materials they could not adhere to. One diver traced the line of the tether carefully, following it with a light until it vanished beneath the sand. Another examined the wheels more closely, confirming what he had suspected. They were not functional in any meaningful sense. Either locked in place or never meant to rotate at all. They communicated in hand signals, brief and deliberate. No one rushed. No one touched without purpose. As they circled, something else became clear. The seabed around the car bore subtle marks that did not align with natural currents, slight depressions, areas where sand density changed abruptly, signs that the ground had once been disturbed deliberately and then allowed to settle back into stillness. It was not a wreck site. It was a placement. They tested the object gently. A single strop passed beneath the chassis, chosen carefully to avoid edges that might cut or snag. When tension was applied, the result was immediate and unmistakable. The line went taut, muscles strained, nothing moved. They paused, exchanging glances through masks that conveyed more than any signal could. This was not the resistance of suction alone. It was not just sand holding something in place. It was weight, immense, uncompromising weight. They adjusted, checked angles, Tried again with 2 divers braced. The result was the same. The strop hummed with tension. The car remained exactly where it was, unmoved and unbothered. A chill crept through him that had nothing to do with water temperature. Empty things did not weigh like this. They backed off slightly, reassessing. Lights swept beneath the car, revealing structural elements that should not have existed. Reinforcements. Thickened sections of metal. Welds that looked deliberate rather than repaired. This was no standard vehicle shell. The tether demanded attention. Carefully, painstakingly, they cleared sand away from where it disappeared beneath the surface. Hands moved slowly, pushing grains aside without stirring clouds that would blind them. Inch by inch, the line emerged. It led not to debris or rock, but to hardware. A steel ring, heavy, industrial, bolted into something that did not belong on the seabed. A base, flat, solid, artificial. The kind of anchoring point used to secure objects meant to resist force, not drift gently. That was when certainty replaced speculation. This object had been installed. No one signaled excitement. No triumphant gestures followed the discovery. The mood shifted into something quieter, heavier. Awareness replaced curiosity. The kind that made every movement deliberate and every decision carry weight beyond the moment. They searched for additional attachments and found them. A second line, partially buried, positioned to distribute stress. Redundancy built into the design. Whoever had placed the car had anticipated attempts to move it, whether by currents or by people. They hovered there, suspended above a secret that had waited undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. The ocean around them remained silent, unconcerned. The decision they reached was unspoken, but unanimous. They would attempt to raise it, but not by brute force and not by cutting anything they did not fully understand. The object would be treated as a single unit. Whatever lay inside would come up with it, intact or not at all. They adjusted their rigging, preparing for a controlled lift rather than an extraction. Short pulses, incremental tension, constant monitoring. When they applied lift again, the resistance was still there, but this time it changed. The car did not leap free. It responded slowly, reluctantly, as if acknowledging the effort without yielding easily. A subtle shift in the sand confirmed movement. A few inches, no more. They froze. In that moment, something about the resistance felt intentional. Not just mass, but design. As if the object had been meant to stay, yet not permanently. As if it would allow itself to be moved only under careful, patient effort. When they eased off, the car settled back, undisturbed. They did not try again that day. As they ascended, he glanced back one last time. The car rested exactly as it had before, unbothered by their attention. The tether remained tight, the seabed calm, but the certainty remained. They were no longer dealing with a strange object. They were dealing with a message that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be read. The days that followed the second dive were marked by restraint rather than action. No one involved pretended otherwise. The object on the seabed had changed the nature of what they were doing, shifting it from curiosity into something that demanded patience and discipline. The car was not going anywhere, but the wrong decision could turn a controlled recovery into an irreversible mistake. They all understood that the ocean punished impatience far more efficiently than ignorance. Preparation replaced speculation. They reviewed footage frame by frame, studying the way the car responded to tension, the subtle flex in the rigging, the way the sand behaved beneath it. They replayed the moment when it had shifted those few inches and then refused to go further. The movement had not felt random. It had felt moderated, as though the resistance had a threshold, one that had been reached and acknowledged. On the morning they returned, the sea greeted them with the same calm indifference as before. No warning signs, no dramatic change in weather. The kind of conditions that lulled people into thinking the day would be straightforward. He knew better now. Calm water did not mean simple outcomes. The descent carried a familiar gravity, heavier this time with intent. Every diver moved with deliberate precision, spacing themselves carefully, maintaining visibility and awareness. The seabed came into view slowly, and with it the now familiar silhouette. Even from a distance, the car asserted itself, not as a foreign object, but as something integrated into the environment through sheer persistence. They approached cautiously, resisting the temptation to repeat previous steps without reassessment. The plan had evolved. This time, they would not simply test the object's willingness to move. They would listen to what its resistance was telling them. Rigging was adjusted with meticulous care. The strops were repositioned to distribute load evenly across the reinforced sections of the chassis. Lift bags were prepared but left slack, their buoyancy held in reserve rather than deployed immediately. Every choice reflected a single guiding principle. If the car resisted, they would stop. When tension was applied again, the response was immediate. The strops tightened. The car did not budge. They increased force incrementally, watching for any sign of shift, any indication that the seabed or the tether was yielding. The sand beneath the car compressed slightly, grains sliding into new configurations, but the object itself remained unmoved. It was as though the car had become part of the ground it rested on. That was when the weight truly announced itself. This was not the weight of corrosion or accumulated sediment. It was not the sluggish inertia of an object long submerged. It was dense, absolute, unyielding. The kind of resistance one expected from solid mass, from something that had no internal voids, no give. Yet they knew the interior was hollow, or at least it should have been. He hovered near the front wheel well, adjusting his light to peer beneath the chassis. The beam revealed details they had only partially understood before. Reinforcements ran along the underside, thickened ribs of metal that had no place in a standard vehicle. Welds were visible, clean and deliberate, laid down with precision rather than haste. This was not reinforcement added after damage. It was reinforcement designed from the beginning. The conclusion settled heavily in his mind. The car was not heavy because it had deteriorated. It was heavy because it had been built to be. They paused, exchanging signals, agreeing without words to change tactics. If the object would not move, the next step was to understand why. They shifted focus to the tether, the quiet line that had drawn their attention from the beginning. Carefully, they began clearing sand from around the anchor point. Hands moved slowly, pushing grains aside with deliberate gentleness. The goal was not speed, but clarity. Every particle displaced carried the risk of obscuring what lay beneath. As the sand receded, the tether revealed its termination. A steel ring, thick and industrial, its surface dulled by years underwater but unmistakably functional. It was not a piece of scrap. It was hardware, designed to bear load. The ring was bolted into a base that emerged gradually from the sand. Flat, broad, artificial. It sat flush against the seabed, distributing force across its surface. This was no improvisation. It was an anchor point meant to endure. They traced the edges of the base, confirming its shape and scale. It extended farther than expected, suggesting stability far beyond what a single tether would require. And then they found the second line. Partially buried, positioned at a different angle, it ran from the car to another point in the sand. Redundancy, load sharing, design principles used by people who anticipated stress, who planned for resistance rather than hoping to avoid it. The realization settled in slowly but decisively. This object had not been dumped. It had not been hidden hastily. It had been installed with forethought and care, using methods that suggested experience and intent. He felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with air consumption. The ocean was full of lost things, but this was something else. This was something placed, secured, and left behind with purpose. They discussed their next steps through signals and brief pauses. Cutting the tether was dismissed almost immediately. Severing a line under tension could cause unpredictable movement, potentially dangerous for everyone involved. More importantly, cutting without understanding what the tether restrained could release forces they were unprepared to manage. Instead, they chose patience. They began by loosening the sand around the base itself, not to remove it but to reduce the friction holding it in place. The work was slow, methodical, and exhausting in its own way. Time passed unnoticed as they carved out a shallow depression around the anchor, careful not to destabilize the seabed beyond what they could control. When they applied lift again, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The car resisted as before, but the resistance felt different. Not absolute, not immovable. The tension in the strops translated into a slow, grudging response. The car shifted. Only a few inches, barely enough to register visually, but enough to send a ripple of awareness through the group. The movement was controlled, almost polite. There was no sudden release, no lurch or tilt. It rose as if acknowledging the effort rather than surrendering to it. They froze immediately, holding position, watching for any secondary movement. The anchor held, the tethers remained taut. Nothing snapped. Nothing collapsed. He felt his pulse quicken despite his efforts to remain calm. This was progress, but it was also confirmation of something unsettling. The object was not resisting because it was trapped. It was resisting because it was designed to resist. They eased off the lift, allowing the car to settle back into place. The movement reversed smoothly, returning to its original position without drama. That alone was telling. Objects not meant to move rarely return to rest so neatly. They repeated the process, applying lift in short, measured pulses. Each time the car responded in the same way. A slight rise, a pause. No more. Then, on the third attempt, something changed. As the car lifted, the anchor beneath it shifted. Not abruptly, but with a soft, unmistakable jolt that traveled up the tether and into the rigging. The base tilted just enough to break the compacted grip of the sand that had held it for so long. The sound was felt more than heard, a muted vibration that resonated through metal and water alike. The anchor did not tear free violently. It yielded as if its purpose had finally been fulfilled. The car rose another few inches. They stopped again, holding position, scanning for instability. The seabed beneath the former anchor point released a small cloud of silt, swirling upward before dispersing. Within that cloud, something caught the beam of his light. A flash. Flat, metallic. He drifted closer, careful not to disturb the sediment further. As the silt cleared, the object resolved into a plate, partially embedded in the ground. It was rectangular, its surface worn but intact. He brushed sand away gently, revealing markings etched deep enough to survive decades underwater. Letters, numbers, a date. His stomach tightened. Tags meant ownership. Ownership meant history. He signaled the others, drawing their attention to the plate. They hovered nearby, lights converging, all of them reading the same silent message. This was not an anonymous object. It had been catalogued, labeled, claimed by someone who had expected it to remain. They did not attempt to remove the plate. Not yet. Everything about this demanded restraint. Instead, they returned their focus to the car itself. With the anchor loosened, the resistance changed again. The object no longer clung to the seabed with the same insistence. When lift was applied now, the car rose slowly but steadily, its movement smooth and deliberate. It was as though the final barrier had been psychological rather than physical. They guided it upward with care, controlling ascent to avoid sudden pressure changes or uncontrolled drift. The tethers, once instruments of restraint, now served as stabilizers, keeping the car aligned as it left the seabed for the first time in years. As it rose, something else happened. A pocket of trapped silt, long sealed beneath the chassis, released itself into the water. The cloud billowed outward, briefly obscuring the view. Within it, shapes flickered and vanished. Fragments of the seabed's long memory stirred into motion. And then, from beneath the car, something detached. It was small, compact, and fell slowly, tumbling end over end before settling gently back onto the sand. Not debris, not corrosion. Something intentional. He marked the spot instinctively, committing its position to memory even as the car continued its ascent. Whatever had fallen had been sheltered by the object above it, protected by its presence. The car moved higher now, leaving behind a disturbed patch of seabed that looked suddenly exposed, as if a secret had been peeled away. The anchor lay tilted, no longer serving its purpose. The tether slackened. They followed the car upward until it disappeared into brighter water above, their attention divided between the ascent and the knowledge that something had been left behind. As they began their own ascent, maintaining safety stops and discipline despite the pull of discovery, he felt a profound shift settle into place. The ocean had yielded something, not reluctantly, but on its own terms. Whatever lay inside that car, whatever story it held, it had been waiting for a moment like this. Not for force, not for chance, but for careful hands willing to listen to resistance rather than fight it. By the time they broke the surface, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The hardest part of this discovery was not beneath the water anymore. The surface received the car without spectacle. There was no dramatic breach of water, no violent surge as it emerged. It rose slowly, obedient to the control lines, water cascading from its frame in thin sheets that caught the light before slipping back into the sea. The moment it cleared the surface, a silence settled over the boat that felt heavier than the object itself. Everyone stood still, watching, as if sudden movement might undo what had taken so much care to accomplish. Up close, in open air, the car looked even more wrong. From a distance, it could still be mistaken for a vehicle abandoned to time, its body coated with marine growth, its color erased by years underwater. But, at arm's length, the illusion broke down. The proportions were perfect, too perfect, as if the car were an idea of a car rather than a machine that had once lived on roads. The panels were straight. The curves were smooth. The edges were sharp beneath the crust of barnacles. Nothing sagged. Nothing collapsed under its own weight. As it was secured alongside the boat, seawater streamed from the seams in narrow lines that looked almost deliberate, like channels meant to guide the flow rather than resist it. The smell of the ocean clung to the surface, but beneath it there was something else. Faint and unsettling, a dry undertone that did not belong to an object that had spent so many years submerged. He climbed aboard and stood with the others, close enough now to see the details that had been hidden below. The tether, once taut and purposeful, hung slack, its role complete. The anchor point beneath the car was no longer visible, lost again to the water that closed over it without comment. Whatever connection had bound the object to the seabed was broken, and yet nothing about the car suggested damage or distress. It had left the ocean as calmly as it had entered it. They did not rush to touch it. Habit and instinct held them back. Objects recovered from depth carried risks that were not always visible. Pressure differentials, trapped gases, internal stresses. The car had been patient with them so far. They intended to return the courtesy. When they began their inspection, it was with restraint. Hands traced the surface lightly, brushing away growth in small patches rather than stripping it bare. Beneath the barnacles, the metal was intact, far more intact than it should have been. Corrosion was present, but superficial, as though the underlying material had resisted decay with unusual determination. He tapped the side panel gently with a tool, listening rather than looking. The sound that answered was wrong. Not the hollow ring of thin sheet metal, nor the dull thud of rusted steel. It was deeper, muted, layered, the kind of sound produced by thickness rather than emptiness. They moved around the car, repeating the test in different places. Each time, the response was the same. The body did not behave like a shell. It behaved like a casing. Attention turned to the doors. The handles were intact, their shapes softened by growth but unmistakable. They had not been torn away or seized by corrosion. He reached for one, then paused, glancing at the others. No one stopped him. No one encouraged him either. The decision was his. He applied the slightest pressure. The handle moved, not freely, not easily, but it moved, shifting a fraction of an inch with a resistance that felt mechanical rather than corroded. That alone sent a ripple of unease through the group. Doors exposed to salt water for years did not move like that. They seized, they broke, they did not yield. He released it and stepped back, letting the moment breathe. Whatever was behind that door had remained sealed by design, not by chance. Opening it was not just an act of curiosity, it was a commitment. They secured the car more thoroughly before proceeding, ensuring it would not shift or tip unexpectedly. Only when stability was guaranteed did he return to the door. This time he pulled more deliberately. The seal broke with a sound so soft it was almost imagined, a slight sigh that carried something with it. A smell slipped free, subtle but unmistakable. Not seawater, not oil or decay. It was the scent of enclosed air, stale and dry, tinged with wood and time. The kind of smell released when something sealed long ago finally remembers how to breathe. No one spoke. The door opened a little more, revealing darkness within. He angled his light inside, half expecting to see the corroded remains of an interior, collapsed seats, tangled wiring. What he saw instead made him still. There was no interior, no dashboard, no upholstery, no signs of an engine bay or mechanical systems. The space inside was clean in its emptiness, shaped not for passengers but for containment. The walls were reinforced with ribs and layers that suggested engineering rather than automotive design. The surfaces were dry, completely dry. At the center of that hollow space sat a chest. It did not gleam. It did not announce itself as treasure or spectacle. It rested there with quiet certainty, wedged precisely where it would not shift even if the car moved. Barnacles clung to its edges, reaching out from the surrounding metal as if trying to claim it, but they had not succeeded. The chest's surface bore marks of age, but not damage. It had been protected. For a long moment, no one moved closer. The implication was too large to grasp all at once. An object submerged for decades should not contain dry air. It should not shelter wood from rot, paper from dissolution. And yet, here it was, waiting. He climbed part way into the opening, careful not to disturb anything. The chest was heavier than it looked, but not immovable. He tested it gently, confirming it was not fixed in place. Whatever had been intended to hold it there had succeeded without force. They lifted it together, hands steady, aware that this was no longer a simple recovery operation. This was an unsealing. The chest came free without resistance. As it was brought out into the light, water ran off its surface but did not soak in. The wood, if it was wood, had been treated, sealed against the ocean with care that bordered on obsession. They set it down on the deck between them, the space around it clearing instinctively, as if it demanded respect. Only then did the carvings become fully visible. They were not decorative. There was no flourish, no attempt at beauty. Names were etched into the surface, initials repeated in different hands or at different times. Dates followed, some scratched deep, others barely traced. One date in particular drew his eye and held it. It was old. Old enough that seeing it here felt like a mistake, as if time itself had folded incorrectly. He swallowed, suddenly aware of how dry his throat felt. They did not open the chest immediately. There was a gravity to it that discouraged haste. Instead, they examined it as they had the car, noting the seams, the lock, the way the lid fit into the body. It was built to keep something out as much as to keep something in. The seal had done its job perfectly. When they finally lifted the lid, it resisted just enough to make everyone lean back, instincts flaring. Then it gave. The air that escaped was unmistakably human, not in any grotesque sense, but in its familiarity. It smelled like rooms long closed, like paper and ink and breath captured in stillness. It carried no hint of the sea. Inside were stacks of paper, wrapped and rewrapped with care. Letters folded into precise shapes. Photographs protected by layers of cloth and waxed material. Small notebooks, their covers worn smooth by handling. Everything was arranged with intention, not hurried or careless, but methodical. He picked up one of the bundles, turning it slowly in his hands. The paper was yellowed, but intact. The ink had pressed deep into the fibers, each line a deliberate act of preservation. Whoever had written these words had not trusted time to be kind. As they examined the contents, a pattern emerged. The letters spoke of waiting, of promises made in uncertainty, of plans that extended beyond the present moment, beyond even survival. One line appeared again and again, written in different contexts but with the same weight. If I do not return, this will. The photographs filled in what the words hinted at: a young man in uniform, standing near the water. A woman beside him, her expression caught between hope and restraint. And in the background of several images, the same car. Not as it was now, but as it had once been, whole and familiar before it had been hollowed out and transformed. The realization settled slowly, heavy and undeniable. This was not cargo, not art, not a hiding place for stolen goods. It was a message. They went through the chest carefully, piece by piece, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Each item carried weight far beyond its physical form. These were not scraps meant to be found accidentally. They were meant to endure, to wait. By the time the sun dipped lower and the shadows lengthened across the deck, they all understood the same thing. The car had not been sunk to disappear. It had been sunk to survive. And now that it had surfaced, the story it carried would not remain silent much longer. The chest sat on the deck as if it had always belonged there, a quiet, unassuming presence that nevertheless drew every eye back to it again and again. The car, monumental in its strange integrity, faded into the background for the moment, reduced to a vessel that had done its job. What mattered now was what had been protected, not what had protected it. They did not crowd the chest. Space formed around it naturally, a wide circle of unspoken restraint. No one wanted to be the first to break whatever spell had kept its contents intact for so long. The sea had failed to claim it. Time had failed to claim it. There was a sense, faint but unmistakable, that careless hands might succeed where the ocean had not. He knelt beside it slowly, aware of every movement, every sound. The deck creaked beneath his weight, and the ordinary noise felt intrusive, almost disrespectful. He placed his hands flat on the wood and felt its surface under his palms. It was cool, but not damp. The grain was visible beneath layers of sealant and age, the texture worn smooth in places where it had once been handled often. This was not a box meant to be buried and forgotten. It had been built to be opened again. The lid rested back on its hinges, revealing the carefully arranged interior. The bundles of letters lay stacked with deliberate order, separated by thin wooden slats that prevented them from shifting. Cloth wrapped each stack, the fabric faded but intact, its weave tight and purposeful. Someone had thought about friction, about movement, about what years of subtle vibration might do to fragile paper. This was not the work of sentiment alone. It was the work of someone who understood materials and failure. He lifted the first bundle and carried it to a clear section of the deck where the light fell more directly. Others followed, moving with the same quiet care, laying out the contents piece by piece. The photographs were removed last, still bound together with a length of twine that had darkened with age, but not rotted through. Even the knot held. The first letter he unfolded trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the weight of crossing an invisible boundary. Ink lines emerged slowly as the paper flattened, each stroke confident and deep, pressed hard enough that the words had embossed themselves faintly on the reverse side. The handwriting was steady, disciplined, not hurried, the kind of script written by someone who had learned to value clarity over flourish. The words spoke plainly at first. Dates, locations, weather. Mundane details that anchored the writer firmly in the physical world. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. The letters grew longer, more personal. The writer described days spent near the coast, working with machines and materials, salvaging what could be recovered and dismantling what could not. He wrote about the sea as a workplace rather than a force of wonder, describing it in terms of currents, loads, corrosion, and pressure. It became clear that the man who had written these letters was an engineer by temperament, if not by formal title. He thought in systems, he documented processes. Even his personal reflections carried an undercurrent of analysis, as though he were always testing his own assumptions against reality. As more letters were read, a larger picture emerged. He had been assigned to work near the shoreline during the war, part of a unit responsible for managing damaged equipment and vehicles, ensuring that nothing usable fell into the wrong hands. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and dangerous in ways that did not lend themselves to heroism. Machines failed unpredictably. Storms arrived without warning. Accidents were common, and explanations were not always forthcoming. The letters hinted at things that were never fully stated, references to orders that did not align with what he saw, to vessels that vanished without official acknowledgement, to cargo that was logged one way and later accounted for another. He never accused. He never speculated openly, but the gaps between his words carried their own meaning. He wrote often to a woman whose name appeared again and again, her presence woven through even the most technical descriptions. She was the anchor in his writing, the point to which every thought eventually returned. He described her in small, precise observations rather than grand declarations. The way she stood near the car when he worked on it. The way she watched the water without speaking. The way she trusted him without needing reassurance. The car appeared in the letters gradually, first as an ordinary object, then as a problem to be solved. He wrote about its structure, its limitations, its potential, about how metal behaved under pressure, how seams failed, how salt found its way into every weakness. He wrote about experiments, about sealing methods, about materials scavenged and repurposed from other projects. Then came the turning point, marked not by drama but by a quiet shift in language. He began to write about preservation, about the impossibility of keeping certain things safe on land, about the risk of confiscation, of censorship, of simple loss. He wrote about the sea as a place of paradox, destructive yet consistent, violent yet predictable. Unlike people, the ocean did not reinterpret what it was given. The idea formed slowly, methodically. He outlined it in sketches and notes found tucked between the letters. Diagrams of the car, stripped of unnecessary components, reinforced from within. Calculations of buoyancy and mass. Estimates of pressure at specific depths. Lists of materials required to create seals that could endure without maintenance. He did not describe the project as an act of defiance. He described it as an insurance policy. The photographs reinforced the story. They showed the car in stages of transformation, its interior gutted, its panels removed and replaced. They showed him at work, sleeves rolled up, hands dark with grease and sealant. Other figures appeared occasionally in the background, but their faces were never the focus. This was his undertaking, personal and solitary even when others were nearby. One photograph stopped him entirely. It showed the car on the shoreline, waves lapping at its tires, the sun low in the sky. The man stood beside it, knee-deep in water, his posture relaxed but resolute. He was not posing. He was waiting. On the back of the photograph, a date had been written, along with a single sentence, pressed so hard into the paper that the impression could be felt through the wood of the chest beneath it. If I do not come back, this will. The chest contained more than letters and photographs. Beneath the personal correspondence lay documents of a different kind. Reports copied by hand, lists of names, coordinates marked with care. These were not originals. They were duplicates, created with the express purpose of surviving when the originals might not. The man had known the value of redundancy. He had built it into everything he touched. As they examined these papers, the weight of what they held grew heavier. Names appeared that matched records of men declared missing, lost at sea under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Dates aligned with known operations that had ended abruptly or without detailed accounting. The documents did not accuse, but they illuminated. They provided context where there had been silence. He felt the shift within himself as he absorbed the scope of it. This was no longer just a recovered archive. It was a record of decisions and consequences, preserved by someone who had understood that truth could be as fragile as paper. They handled everything slowly, cataloging what they could without removing anything from its context. Photographs were placed back where they belonged. Letters were refolded along their original creases. Nothing was forced. Nothing was rearranged for convenience. There was an unspoken agreement that the chest would remain intact until it could be examined under proper conditions. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the deck, a quiet understanding settled over the group. The discovery had passed the point of private ownership. This was not a story they could keep to themselves, nor one they could release carelessly. It demanded expertise, context, and above all, respect for the people whose lives it represented. He closed the chest carefully, lowering the lid until it met the seal once more. The sound was soft, final in a way that felt temporary rather than conclusive. The chest had waited decades to be opened. It could wait a little longer to be understood. That night, as the car and chest were secured and preparations were made to transport them safely, sleep came reluctantly. His mind returned again and again to the words he had read, to the deliberate care that had gone into every choice the writer had made. The man had not hidden these things out of fear. He had hidden them out of faith. Faith that someone, someday, would find them and know what to do. By morning, that faith rested heavily on his shoulders. The days that followed unfolded with a strange duality, as if two timelines were now running alongside each other. In one, the world continued as it always had, indifferent to the quiet revelation that had surfaced from the sea. In the other, the contents of the chest began to reorder the past with slow, methodical insistence. What had been sealed away was no longer simply preserved. It was active now, exerting pressure, demanding interpretation. The first step was restraint. Nothing was released publicly. No images circulated beyond the small group already involved. The chest and its contents were transferred to a controlled environment, one chosen for its neutrality rather than prestige. Climate control replaced seawater. Gloves replaced bare hands. Every page was handled as if it might be the last surviving copy, because in many cases it was. He remained present through all of it, not because anyone demanded it, but because leaving felt wrong. This was no longer a matter of curiosity or discovery. He had become part of the chain that connected intention to outcome, and stepping away would have broken something he could not yet name. The process of identification began slowly, deliberately. Names were cross-referenced against public records, military archives, shipping logs, coastal registries. Dates were checked, rechecked, then checked again. The handwriting became familiar enough that he could recognize it instantly, even when only a single word appeared on a page. The writer's voice, once confined to folded paper, began to feel present, persistent, unwilling to fade quietly back into obscurity. The man's identity emerged not through a single dramatic confirmation, but through accumulation. A service number mentioned in passing, a unit designation scribbled in the margin of a technical note, a photograph showing a partial insignia on a uniform sleeve. Each fragment added weight, narrowing the field until doubt gave way to certainty. He had been listed as missing, not declared dead, not honored with a grave or a full account, simply missing. His name one among many suspended indefinitely between acknowledgement and erasure. Official reports recorded his last assignment, his last known location, then dissolved into ambiguity. Weather conditions, operational confusion, loss at sea. The language was familiar to historians, the kind used when answers were inconvenient or unavailable. The letters filled in what those reports did not. They spoke of work that extended beyond official duties, of salvage operations that were never fully documented, of materials redirected and reassigned under pressure and secrecy. The writer did not frame these actions as rebellion. He described them as inevitabilities, decisions made in moments where rules failed to account for reality. As more documents were examined, a pattern emerged that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Several incidents, previously treated as isolated losses, intersected in time and place with the man's assignments. Ships that vanished without wreckage. Equipment listed as destroyed that later appeared elsewhere. Personnel transfers that ended abruptly, leaving gaps that had never been satisfactorily explained. None of the documents accused anyone by name. There were no manifestos, no denunciations. The writer had been careful even then, but he had preserved enough context to make denial difficult. Coordinates matched known exclusion zones, dates aligned with operations that had been classified for decades, and then quietly declassified with much of their substance removed. What unsettled everyone involved was not the scale of the revelations, but their tone. The man had not written as someone expecting vindication. He had written as someone preparing for disappearance. His notes on the construction of the car container were precise, technical, almost detached. He explained his choices with the same clarity he used to describe load-bearing tolerances or material fatigue. He had known, with a certainty that bordered on acceptance, that he might not survive to explain any of it himself. The car had been his proxy. As the technical documents were studied more closely, the ingenuity of the design became impossible to ignore. The reinforced interior, the layered sealing methods, the calculated balance between mass and buoyancy. Even the anchoring system revealed a mind that anticipated future interference without relying on force alone. The car was meant to resist casual discovery, not determined care. It was designed to stay hidden until someone approached it the right way. He realized then that the resistance they had felt during the lift had not been accidental. It had been a test, not of strength, but of judgment. The final photograph confirmed what the letters implied. It showed the man alone at the shoreline, the car partially submerged, his posture neither hurried nor hesitant. On the back, in the same deliberate hand, was a note that read, less like instruction and more like acknowledgement. If you're reading this, it means I was right to wait. That line stayed with him. As historians and archivists became involved, the process accelerated without losing its care. Specialists verified paper composition, ink age, photographic processes. Nothing contradicted the timeline suggested by the letters. If anything, the materials appeared to have survived better than anyone expected, a testament to the effectiveness of the container and the foresight behind it. With verification came consequence. Records, long considered settled, were reopened. Families whose questions had gone unanswered for generations were suddenly relevant again. Names that had existed only in footnotes returned to active discussion. The chest did not overturn history in a dramatic sweep. It did something quieter and more unsettling. It introduced doubt where certainty had been assumed, and context where silence had been accepted. Throughout it all, he remained acutely aware of his position. He was not the owner of the story. He was not its interpreter. He was a witness, a conduit through which something long denied had finally surfaced. That awareness shaped every decision he made, every conversation he entered. There were moments of pressure. Institutions expressed interest, some transparent, others less so. Questions arose about custody, about classification, about the appropriate channels for release. The language shifted subtly, from curiosity to control. It became clear that not everyone welcomed the return of these details, no matter how carefully documented. He felt the weight of choice pressing in from all sides. To step back entirely would be to surrender the narrative to systems that had already failed once. To push forward recklessly would risk distorting the very truth the man had worked so hard to preserve. The answer, when it came, was simple in principle and difficult in execution. Everything would be done openly, methodically, with corroboration at every step. No selective release, no sensational framing. The story would emerge the way it had been written, patiently and whole. Late one evening, as he reviewed the last of the copied documents, he found a final entry tucked into a notebook's back cover. It was shorter than the others, written in smaller script, as if space itself had become precious. The writer acknowledged the possibility that the chest might be found by someone who did not understand its purpose, someone who might see only a strange object and a collection of old papers. He wrote that this was acceptable. The car had been built to wait, not to demand. If the story never surfaced, it would not mean it had been meaningless. It would simply mean that the time had not arrived. But if it did surface, if someone took the trouble to understand before acting, then the waiting would have been justified. He closed the notebook and sat back, the words settling into him with unexpected force. The past had not simply reached forward. It had entrusted itself to restraint, to judgment, to the hope that care would outlast convenience. And now that trust was no longer abstract. It was personal. As preparations began to contact the families named in the letters, he felt a quiet certainty take hold. The most difficult part of the journey lay ahead, not in the exposure of forgotten truths, but in their return to the people who had lived with absence for most of their lives. The chest had preserved memory. What remained was to restore it. The moment the search turned outward, toward the living, the nature of the discovery changed again. Until then, the story had belonged to objects and documents, to paper and metal and the quiet logic of reconstruction. It had unfolded in controlled rooms under measured light, guided by professionals trained to handle fragile remnants of the past. But memory did not remain contained once names were spoken aloud. It traveled. It reached people who had lived with unanswered questions for decades, people whose lives had been shaped not by certainty, but by absence. The first contact was made carefully. No dramatic announcements, no sudden revelations delivered without preparation. Each family was approached through intermediaries who understood the weight of what they carried. Letters were sent first, brief and respectful, explaining that materials had been recovered that might relate to a relative listed as missing during the war. No promises were made, no conclusions were offered, only the possibility of clarity. Responses came slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Some families hesitated, unsure whether to reopen wounds that had scarred but never fully healed. Others replied almost immediately, driven by a need they had learned to suppress but never extinguish. The past, it seemed, had been waiting for them as much as it had waited on the seabed. When the first meeting was arranged, it took place in a small, neutral space chosen for its lack of symbolism. No flags, no institutional emblems, just a quiet room, clean and unobtrusive, where history could be handled without spectacle. He was present, sitting slightly apart, not as an authority but as the person through whom this chain of events had begun. The family arrived with hesitation written into every movement. Their faces bore the lines of years spent living with uncertainty, with stories half told and memories carefully guarded. They did not look like people expecting resolution. They looked like people bracing themselves for disappointment. The chest was brought in last. It rested on the table between them, unchanged, its surface marked by the same names and dates that had first drawn his eye. For a moment, no one spoke. The air itself seemed to pause, as if aware that something irreversible was about to occur. When the lid was opened, recognition moved through the room with quiet force. One of them reached forward without thinking, stopping just short of touching the letters, as though afraid they might dissolve under his fingers. Another leaned back suddenly, breath catching, eyes fixed on a photograph that had not been visible a moment before. They recognized the handwriting instantly. It was not the words themselves that broke the restraint they had carried in with them. It was the loops of letters, the pressure of the pen, the idiosyncrasies that no official document ever captured, the way he crossed his lines, the way he formed certain characters. These were details known only to those who had lived with him, who had received his notes, who had learned to read him, not just for meaning, but for presence. The reaction was not loud. There were no dramatic outbursts. Grief, when it finally surfaced, did so in the way it always had for them, contained but overwhelming. Tears came silently. Hands trembled. Someone pressed a fist to their mouth, not to stifle sound, but to steady themselves. They read slowly, each letter unfolding a piece of a life they had last known through fragments. The man they found on those pages was both familiar and changed. Older, perhaps more tired than they remembered, but unmistakably himself. He worried about them. He thought about the future they might share. He wrote, not knowing whether his words would ever be read, yet writing as though the act itself mattered. The photographs deepened the impact. Faces, long preserved only in memory, emerged with clarity. A smile caught mid-motion. A stance that recalled 100 small gestures no one else would notice. And always in the background, the car, appearing again and again like a quiet companion to his thoughts. The realization settled gradually. He had not disappeared without trace. He had left something behind deliberately, carefully, trusting that time and circumstance would align. The war had taken his body, but not his voice. As the family absorbed this truth, the broader implications of the discovery continued to unfold beyond that room. Archivists and historians worked in parallel, verifying and contextualizing the materials. Their findings confirmed what the letters suggested. Several incidents previously classified as accidents or unexplained losses now carried new weight. The recovered documents did not accuse, but they challenged. They asked questions that could no longer be dismissed as speculative. Institutions responded cautiously. There were requests for access, framed as offers of assistance. There were discussions about classification, about the potential impact of releasing certain details. The language used was careful, almost gentle, but beneath it lay an unmistakable tension. History, once reopened, rarely remained tidy. He felt that tension keenly. Calls came more frequently. Meetings were requested. Suggestions were offered, some reasonable, others less so. There was talk of controlled narratives, of emphasizing certain aspects while downplaying others. The phrase public interest appeared often, as though interest itself could be managed. He listened without committing, measuring each proposal against the simple standard he had adopted early on. Would this honor the intent of the man who had built the chest? Would it preserve the integrity of what had been left behind? The answer was often no. He learned quickly that truth did not need to be dramatic to be threatening. Sometimes its mere presence was enough. The documents did not expose vast conspiracies or hidden empires. They revealed something far more uncomfortable: ordinary decisions made under extraordinary pressure, the quiet erasure of inconvenient facts, the ease with which uncertainty had been allowed to stand in for accountability. As interest grew, so did the risk of distortion. Journalists began to ask questions, some informed, others eager for spectacle. There were offers to buy exclusive access, to frame the discovery as a mystery or a treasure hunt. Each was declined. This was not a story meant to be consumed quickly and forgotten. Throughout it all, the family remained at the center. They were consulted at every step, their wishes respected, even when it complicated matters. Some letters were kept private, their contents too personal for public scrutiny. Others were shared, carefully contextualized, accompanied by documentation that prevented misinterpretation. The process was slow, frustrating at times, but necessary. The day the family chose to release a portion of the letters publicly was marked not by ceremony, but by quiet resolve. They stood together, older now than the people in the photographs, yet visibly lighter. Not because the past had been undone, but because it had finally been acknowledged. When the story reached the wider world, it did so without fanfare. No sensational headlines, no dramatic revelations framed as entertainment. Just facts supported by documents accompanied by human context. The response was measured but profound. Historians debated interpretations. Veterans' families reached out, wondering if their own unanswered questions might find echoes in this discovery. For him, the attention was an unwelcome but unavoidable consequence. He found himself positioned as a figure of authority he had never sought to be. He responded as best he could, always redirecting focus to the materials themselves, to the man who had built the container, to the families who now carried its legacy forward. Yet, even as one chapter seemed to close, another quietly opened. During a final review of the documents slated for archival storage, a historian noted a set of coordinates that had not been fully examined. They appeared briefly in a technical notebook referenced without explanation, then never mentioned again. The context suggested something unfinished, a secondary point of interest the writer had not lived long enough to secure. The family was informed. They considered the implications carefully. No immediate action was taken. There was no rush to return to the sea in search of another secret. The primary story had been restored. The weight carried by the chest had been shared, its purpose fulfilled. Still, the coordinates remained. They lingered in his thoughts as he returned to the water weeks later, not to search, but to dive as he once had. The sea felt unchanged, vast and indifferent, yet now layered with meaning. Somewhere beneath its surface, more histories might lie waiting, not for force, but for attention. As he surfaced that day, the horizon stretching wide and familiar before him, he understood something that had taken time to settle. The discovery had not ended with the return of memory to those who had lost it. It had altered the present as surely as it had clarified the past. The chest had not simply preserved a story, it had given it back. And, in doing so, it had reminded everyone involved that some things were hidden not to be forgotten, but to be found when the world was finally ready to listen. In the weeks that followed, life resumed a shape that resembled normality, though it could never fully return to what it had been before. The chest was no longer on the deck of a boat or in a temporary workspace. It had found its place, divided carefully between archive and family, its contents stabilized, cataloged, and, where appropriate, returned to the people for whom they had been written. The car, emptied of its purpose yet not of its meaning, stood quietly in controlled storage, and its presence both inert and monumental, like a monument that had not been built to be admired. For him, the quiet was unsettling. He had expected relief once the weight of responsibility lifted, once the story no longer depended on his judgment alone. Instead, he found himself carrying a different burden, one less urgent but deeper. The discovery had changed the way he perceived absence. What had once seemed like empty space now felt occupied by potential, by layers of intent and memory waiting to be recognized. He returned to the water often, though never to the same place with the same expectations. Each dive became an act of recalibration. The sea had not changed, but his understanding of it had. It was no longer just an environment governed by physics and chance. It was also a repository, one that did not discriminate between what it erased and what it preserved. Sometimes destruction was not the end. Sometimes it was the method by which something survived. The coordinates found in the notebook remained unresolved. They were not urgent, not accompanied by any instruction or plea. They existed simply as a reference, a quiet marker that suggested unfinished work. Historians debated their significance, offering cautious theories that ranged from abandoned salvage sites to nothing more than navigational notes. There was no consensus, and perhaps that was appropriate. Not every thread needed to be followed immediately. Some were meant to remain loose, reminders rather than invitations. The family, having received what they needed most, chose not to pursue further discoveries. Their loss had been given shape and voice. They had no desire to reopen the sea in search of more answers. Closure, he learned, was not the same as completion. It was enough to know, enough to remember, enough to let go. Public interest waned gradually, as it always did. New stories replaced old ones. Headlines shifted focus. The recovered letters found their way into academic discussion, into museum exhibits, into carefully curated collections that prioritized context over spectacle. The car itself became an object of quiet fascination, discussed not for what it was, but for what it had done. Engineers studied its construction with admiration, noting the foresight embedded in every reinforcement and seal. It was recognized not as a vehicle, but as a vessel in the truest sense of the word. He was invited more than once to speak publicly about the discovery. He declined most invitations. When he did speak, it was briefly and without embellishment. He described the facts, the process, the care that had been required. He refused to frame himself as anything other than a participant who had happened to be present at the right moment. The story, he insisted, was not about discovery. It was about patience. At times, he returned alone to the stretch of sea where it had begun. The seabed there bore no visible scars. The anchor point had been reclaimed by sand and current, the disturbance smoothed away as if it had never existed. Only he knew precisely where the car had rested, where the tether had disappeared into the ground, where the metal plate had glinted briefly before being documented and preserved. To anyone else, it was just another empty place. Standing above it, he felt no urge to mark the location or to share it. The sea did not require memorials. It remembered in its own way. He thought often of the man who had built the container, of the patience it must have taken to carry out such a project in the midst of war and uncertainty. There had been no guarantee it would work, no certainty it would ever be found. And yet the man had proceeded with care, with restraint, with faith not in outcome, but in process. He had trusted that preservation itself was meaningful, even if recognition never came. That trust resonated deeply. One evening, as he reviewed his own dive logs, he noticed how they had changed over time. Early entries were sparse, focused on metrics and conditions. Later ones included observations, small reflections that bordered on narrative. He realized that, without intending to, he had begun documenting not just where he went, but how the water felt, how certain places lingered in his mind. The sea had taught him a different way of paying attention. He returned once more to the storage facility where the car was kept, standing beside it in silence. Without the chest, it seemed almost incomplete, its purpose fulfilled yet still visible in every reinforced seam and sealed edge. He ran a hand along its surface, feeling the texture beneath the remnants of marine growth. This object had not been designed to move. It had been designed to wait, and it had waited well. In the end, he did not pursue the remaining coordinates. He understood that some stories reach their natural conclusion without exhausting every possibility. The man who had built the container had not asked for everything to be uncovered. He had asked only that what mattered most survive. As he left the facility and stepped back into the open air, the sea visible in the distance, he felt a quiet sense of alignment. Not closure, not triumph, but something steadier. An understanding that attention itself was a form of respect, and that restraint could be as powerful as action. The ocean stretched on, vast and unreadable, holding countless other objects in its depths. Some would remain forever lost. Others, perhaps, were waiting. Not for machines or force or chance, but for someone willing to look twice, to question resistance, to stop when instinct warned and proceed when patience allowed. The story that had surfaced from the seabed had not been meant to astonish. It had been meant to endure. And in that endurance, he saw a reflection of something essential. That not everything taken by time was gone. That some things were merely held, preserved by silence until the moment arrived when they could be returned without being diminished. The sea did not give back what it took lightly, but when it did so with purpose. If this story kept you watching, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. More real discoveries, hidden histories, and stories that were never meant to surface are already waiting for you on this channel. Watch the next video to see another case where one small detail changed everything. And if this story surprised you, share it. Someone else needs to see this too.